Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. Welcome to this special post-election episode of Outrage Overload. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we're tackling a big question. What are American voters trying to tell us with the 2024 election results? This election gave us some surprising outcomes, and it's left many of us wondering what actually drove people's choices this year. Why didn't concerns about January 6th, Trump's handling of classified documents, and allegations of attempting to overturn the 2020 election sway voters? In this episode, we're going to dig into these questions and more with the help of some top experts. We've spoken with two political scientists and a computational anthropologist who will give us their take on what the results mean and what the electorate are trying to tell us. So whether you're feeling hopeful, frustrated, or simply curious after this election, stay with us. Together, we'll unpack what these results mean, explore the deeper messages voters may be sending, and consider what they reveal about the direction of our country. I started off by asking our experts, what do you think voters were trying to tell us with this election? And one message came up more than any other. Inflation, stupid. Here's Leland J. and Dorothy H. Olson Chair and Political Science Professor at the University of Nebraska, Kevin Smith.
I don't think we want to overthink this. I mean, sometimes political junkies like me, we tend to, ascribe motivations and deep rationales to the average voter that I'm not 100% convinced are always there. I mean, if we're trying to extract general messages, I mean, clearly the voters weren't happy with the incumbent administration. And my take on things is, no surprise. I mean, if you look at exit polls, the biggest issue for voters was the economy. People had really been stung by inflation.
Here's Sean Evans, Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Department of Political Science at Union University.
I think overall the public was telling the Democrats that they disapproved of the last 4 years. They were upset about inflation. They were upset about immigration. They were upset about other things. And most elections are simply, do I feel the incumbent party has done a good job? And just like they thought Trump had not done a good job 4 years ago, they thought Biden had not done well the past 4 years, as exemplified by his 42% approval, which makes it awfully hard for his party to win. But the simple fact is, polls of the past 4 years have shown two of the major issues have always been inflation and immigration. For inflation, that was largely up to the Fed, but the Democrats did some things that juiced the economy and made it worse, and they really never tried to do much about it. Another problem, I would say, is that denial is not a good political strategy. They said, well, inflation isn't a problem. When you tell people that what they see is not correct, they're going to believe their eyes more than that. Because when you have inflation, that affects everyone, which is a problem, but that mostly affects poor people whose money does not go as far as it used to. And there are a lot of minority men in particular who decided that the Biden economy made them worse off. They remembered a better Republican economy under Trump. They're hopeful that that will be the case again. Whether that is the case or not will have an impact on whether Trump and the Republicans can maintain the support. And it's also, can the Republican Party maintain that support? Or is this support for Trump in particular because Trump has deviated from Republican economic orthodoxy in ways that can appeal to working class and minority working class voters?
Our experts also pointed out that immigration was another issue where Democrats came up short.
And then in terms of immigration, they did things that made it worse and never tried to do anything about it until the 11th hour, in which case that becomes a problem.
Immigration was another big issue. And I think one of the messages that was sent by the voters is that, we really want the government to get serious about immigration. I mean, there seems to be sort of like this narrative developing that, this we've got to get tougher on immigration. That's really important to a lot of voters, and not just working class whites. There's a lot of Latinos where that's an important issue to them. We have to figure out a more coherent economic message that appeals to certain demographic groups.
Our experts identified another crucial disconnect in the 2024 election cycle: cultural issues. While families worried about paying for groceries and gas, Democratic leaders were seen as spending too much time talking about things like diversity programs and climate initiatives.
Sort of like the DEI cultural issues that seem to, really be a focus, or at least a perceived focus of the elite that, sort of like in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Based on the results last Tuesday, I would be cautious about pushing the cultural things, because I think Trump's message clearly resonated with at least a chunk of the electorate on that, and that wasn't particularly or supportive at all of the progressive viewpoint.
This left many voters feeling their everyday financial struggles weren't being heard.
Perhaps one of the things that can come out of the 2024 presidential election is, there have been rumblings about, males, or especially young males, aren't doing as well as not just females, but other demographic groups in society, period. And maybe one of the useful things that can come out of that is it will force a little bit more attention to be paid on that. I mean, males are not going to college. They're sort of like falling behind in terms of income. They have higher rates of drug use. They have higher suicide rates. And that's a problem. I mean, it's not like it's been completely ignored, but relative to other groups in society, perhaps there hasn't been enough attention paid to that. And one of the things that I think a lot of people in that demographic found attractive about Trump is that his message was effectively, I see you and I hear you, and it's not fair what's happening to you. And sometimes I think that's just enough.
One of the recurring themes from this election seems to be a deep sense of frustration with the political establishment. For many voters, the Democrats' message felt disconnected from their current role in government. Even as they hold significant power, some of their messaging still sounds like they're pushing against the system, almost like they're still the underdogs or rebels. Our expert pointed out that this freedom fighter approach may no longer resonate when you're in charge. To many voters, it sounds like a contradiction. Here's Andrew Van Hort explaining how this disconnect may have led to a sense of cognitive dissonance among middle-of-the-road voters.
They're campaigning as though they're like the revolution, and you're not the revolution anymore. You're the establishment. And I think there's some degree of like maybe self-sabotage there, where sort of the progressive project sort of requires that sort of being the subaltern group or whatever. But I think people were telling them, like, you guys have to learn how to lead as the establishment. You have to learn how to convince people to go along with you as the establishment. Like, you can't just run on this like Handmaid's Tale business, right? And so I think there's a real cognitive dissonance for like the average voter, especially for middle of the road, moderate types, between what they see from the Democrats and from progressives, being that sort of dominant ideology, and the way that they're trying to portray themselves as, these sort of freedom fighters and that sort of thing. And I think they reject that notion entirely. So I think there was sort of a referendum on that idea.
So then there's the threats to democracy and rule of law. January 6th, classified documents, multiple indictments for attempting to overturn an election. For many Americans, the question seems obvious. How could voters choose Donald Trump after such unprecedented challenges to democratic institutions? Yet, in 2024, millions of Americans did just that, and not just the hardcore MAGA voter. Our experts found that what seems inconceivable to some reveals a profound split in how Americans view democracy itself. While Democrats and even some Republicans saw these events as clear threats to the republic, many voters either questioned their significance or saw them through an entirely different lens.
Well, I still think democracy matters. But the thing is, if you look at the polling, different people mean different things by democracy. And that's what it comes down to. With Democrats, it's about more people voting and reflecting the majority, which they typically think is them. And for Republicans, it is about election integrity. Who is voting and the methods they're voting, and make sure that they're fair.
Young voters, for example, were not moved by these messages. U.S. News and World Report found that only about a half of young adults aged 18 to 34 in battleground states firmly agreed that democracy was at stake in the election. A significant portion remained undecided or ambivalent about statements like, democracy is on the ballot, and Trump is a danger to democracy. In battleground states, even voters who acknowledge these concerns often prioritize more immediate pressures, rising costs, housing, affordability, and economic stability.
Yeah, that message certainly didn't land, at least not in a big way that it was persuasive to enough voters to make a difference to the election. I mean, I think part of the problem was the messaging around that. Some of it came off as way too wonkish. But I think for a lot of voters, this sort of thing is just too abstract. I mean, for those of us who pay a lot of attention to politics, we clearly see the critical importance to the republic of preserving democratic values in the democratic process. You know, if you're a single mom working two jobs trying to put mac and cheese on the table, I'm pretty sure that's way down your list of priorities. And you know, are you going to listen to a message that says, well, we defend democracy and, you know, these sort of like abstract values we're for, or are you going to be listening to someone like, I hear you. It sucks what you're going through and I'm going to try and do something about it. I mean, I think one of those is just, you've got a more visceral, direct connection.
The abstract threat of democratic decline simply couldn't compete with the concrete reality of daily financial struggles. And to make matters worse, Trump and his allies successfully pushed back against the Democrats' narrative, effectively flipping the script on who posed a threat to democratic values. Voters heard both sides, each claiming to be democracy's defenders, creating a mirror image effect that left many voters confused and skeptical. Perhaps the most telling was the fatigue factor. After years of dramatic headlines about democratic decline, many voters simply tuned out. The constant drumbeat of warnings had an unexpected effect. In the words of one political strategist, what would once have been political earthquakes had become mere parking tickets to many voters. Next, we looked at whether the demographic shifts of this election suggest an emerging coalition or simply a rebuke of the Biden administration and Democrats in general. When we look at voting patterns of this election, we see some interesting shifts that have caught experts' attention. But there's debate about what these changes really mean for the future.
And then the other big thing that I think we can take from this election is that the coalitions, not just along socioeconomic lines, but even racial and ethnic lines, are not quite what we thought they were, and certainly not what the Democrats thought they were prior to the election. I mean, Trump, I think, moved every demographic group, like racial and ethnically, towards him, with the possible exception of whites, which I have read some exit polling that suggests that his support amongst whites went down by 1%, but he more than made that up with, you know, some pretty impressive gains amongst Latinos, and even made some inroads into the Black community.
For years, Democrats believed demographics would naturally lead to a Democratic majority, the idea that as America became more diverse, it would automatically favor their party. But our experts suggest this theory was more wishful thinking than reality.
I think we have seen the end of the emerging Democratic majority thesis, or the demographics is destiny piece. But that was all based on hope more than reality in this sense. The idea is we're looking at all groups thinking and acting a similar kind of way, and there is plenty of evidence to suggest that that's not the case.
Or the most wildly optimistic estimate I'd give of the number of voters who are movable is 20%. And I think it's more like 5 or 10%. And, are those voters going to, I mean, are they permanently attached to the Trump coalition now? I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, this is the sort of like the second election in which Trump has run, in which you've effectively got two really unpopular candidates. I mean, Trump never broke 50% in terms of approval rating, and Harris has never really been in that range too. I think for a lot of voters, it was just, I'm not wild about either one of these choices, and you give them a different choice, and they might indeed make a very different choice.
What's clearer is a significant change in working class voting patterns.
Now, as to whether we're seeing a realignment, I don't think we really know if it's a realignment for another 10, 20 years. We never really see them as they occur. We know them after the fact. What we do see is that there has been a shift of working class voters to the GOP over several decades. I mean, people talk about Trump bringing working class voters into the GOP. They've been voting GOP for a while. What has been different is the white working class is a larger percentage of the Republican Party than the suburban class, which used to be the base of the Republican Party. And so you're beginning to see a shift. You've also seen a shift of working class minorities, in particular men, moving toward the Republican Party.
However, experts caution against jumping to big conclusions about these changes.
We need to sort of like pump the brakes on the notion that there's this new emergent coalition that is sort of like going to be the MAGA world version of the New Deal coalition that's going to dominate politics for the next 50 years. As you said, it was a narrow victory, but I mean, even in the swing states, you're talking a couple of percentage points. It's not an overwhelming win. And clearly a lot of it is just being driven by people who are angry at and distrustful of the people who are in charge.
Looking back at all we've covered, from shifting coalitions to various disconnects, we shouldn't lose sight of what drove this election at its core: inflation and its impact on everyday Americans. Voters were frustrated not just with inflation itself, but with how it was handled. The dissatisfaction ran deeper than just rising prices. Many Americans felt their concerns were dismissed by elites when they were told inflation was transitory or the economy was actually doing well. When families were struggling with grocery bills and gas prices, being told the economic indicators were positive didn't match their lived experience. In the end, this election reminds us that voters often make their decisions based on kitchen table issues that affect their daily lives. Pundits and strategists will analyze this for years, but sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. When people feel economic pain and believe their leaders aren't taking their concerns seriously, they make their voices heard at the ballot box. Before we wrap up this special episode, I want to take a moment to share a bit of my own take on these election results. I know that a lot of you tune in just for the expert analysis, but some of you have expressed an interest in hearing more of my perspectives, so here we go. In his first term, I knew Trump wasn't kidding when he expressed a desire to be president for life. I'm frankly not sure he knows how to kid. He repeated this theme often throughout his presidency, often testing the waters.
12 more years, 16 more years.
Ha! President for life, that sounds good.
Should we go back to 16 years? Should we do that? Congressman, can we have that extended? You know, the last time I jokingly said that, the papers started saying, he's got despotic tendencies. No, I'm not looking to do it. Unless you want to do it, that's okay.
And the question I asked at that time was, who is going to stop him? It turned out, after the voters had their say in 2020, when Trump tried to follow through on his jokes by attempting to overturn those results, it came down to institutional processes and a few folks, mostly Republicans, in a few key places who stopped him.
One of the things that is concerning is the precedent that has been set, right? Because, when Trump lost in 2020, it was highly unusual for a sitting president who loses an election in a fair election, and it was a fair election. There's basically zero evidence of any systemic, fraud that could have changed the outcome. for a sitting president not to participate in the peaceful transfer of power. And, you can argue about his culpability, but he certainly didn't do anything to really rein in the January 6th, takeover of the Capitol. And, that precedent has been set.
As we continue to see threats to our institutions, we should be reminded that some of our democratic institutions, staffed by individuals committed to upholding the rule of law and democratic principles, did show up in 2020. Of the over 60 lawsuits lodged during the post-election period, Trump secured a favorable outcome in just one instance. This should provide some sense of the resilience of the judicial system as an institution. State and federal judges, election officials, and state governors, many of them Republicans, determined that claims of widespread fraud were baseless despite pressure from Trump and his allies. The Supreme Court, including justices appointed by Trump, declined to hear several election-related cases, effectively upholding lower court decisions that had gone against Trump's claims. Even individuals within Trump's own executive branch played a role in maintaining democratic norms, including ultimately his own vice president when he fulfilled his constitutional duty to certify the Electoral College votes on January 6, 2021, despite intense pressure from Trump and ultimately Trump supporters who were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" as they took over the Capitol building. When we talk about democratic institutions, we have to keep in mind that these are not just abstract ideas, but that these institutions are, indeed, made up of individuals who must choose to uphold democratic norms and processes. In this case, it was often Republicans in key positions who resisted pressure and adhered to their constitutional duties, demonstrating that institutional integrity can transcend partisan loyalties. I say all this to say that yes, our democratic institutions have faced serious challenges recently and are under more pressure than ever, but they're still fairly robust. Despite the setbacks and the threats, our system has checks and balances that have stood the test of time. While it's natural to worry, it's also important to remember that these institutions have weathered storms before. There's a reasonable case to be made that they'll continue to do so. Now voters are putting Trump back in power. Would he still try to be president for life again? Perhaps. He is reported to have already joked, I'm using air quotes here, about the possibility of running for a third term during a meeting with House Republicans, saying, "I suspect I won't be running again, unless you say he's so good we got to figure something else out." At his age now, he may have had enough by 2028 when he'll be 82. Based on his incoherent ramblings at his recent rallies, I frankly wonder how far his mental facilities will hold out this term, but perhaps some of that is just exhaustion from a grueling campaign schedule. It is not hyperbole to say that Donald Trump has demonstrated anti-democratic tendencies throughout his political career and particularly during his 2024 presidential campaign. It's not unreasonable to be concerned. Don't be gaslit on this point. For those who are worried and wondering about the viability of implementing an agenda to weaken norms like accountability, the rule of law, and free and fair elections, we should keep in mind that we still have mostly functioning institutions, as I've noted. But admittedly, it is challenging for folks like me to offer definitive reassurances about backstops to potential attacks on these democratic norms. One expert reminds us that Trump's own behavior might actually be his biggest obstacle.
And part of what I've said is Trump's superpower is self-destruction. So if you're someone concerned about what Trump will do, just remember he's going to shoot himself in the foot on a daily basis.
And there's something else to think about. Despite the clear demonstration of his anti-democratic tendencies, Trump has maintained significant popular support and has now been re-elected, indicating that many Americans either do not view these tendencies as anti-democratic or prioritize other factors in their voting decisions. We can talk about things like checks and balances, public pressure, media scrutiny, and other potential backstops. But maybe a majority of Americans don't care about these backstops and are okay with an anti-democratic agenda, seeing it as necessary reform. Many Americans express deep frustration with the current political system. Only 4% say the political system is working extremely or very well. This, along with other factors, suggests some voters have become more open to drastic changes, even if they challenge democratic norms. Perhaps we're seeing that in these election results. I'll note that the experts we talked to for this episode don't see it that way. They suggest that economic concerns simply overshadowed any worries about democratic institutions for many voters. But this growing anti-government sentiment is real. In the end, I see this as part messaging problem and part a perceived lack of responsiveness on the part of the government and its leaders. When people feel something as an immediate and personal concern, they want to know that their leaders understand and are ready to act. When leaders try to shift focus, telling voters they should be more concerned about other issues, it simply makes matters worse. It sends the message that leaders don't understand or don't care about what's hitting people hardest. Until leaders demonstrate interest in taking real concrete steps to identify and address the immediate concerns of voters, and then are able to effectively communicate those plans or actions, this frustration is likely to grow. Is this election indicative of an emergent and enduring shift toward the GOP? It's possible, but my take is probably not. I think the thin margins we've been seeing for 25 years now will persist. I believe the important message of this election result to leaders on all sides is to first learn how to listen to voters to hear their concerns, then respond to those concerns with clear and actionable plans, and just as importantly, be able to communicate those plans and actions in ways that are authentic and that resonate with voters. Democrats failed on all these metrics, and the voters punished them for it. They'll do the same to Republicans if they make the same mistakes with their newfound power. One would be forgiven at times like this for becoming disillusioned, for wanting to tune out of politics and civic engagement altogether. But for those who can stay involved, our country needs you now more than ever. The American system of democracy was built on the foundation of an informed and engaged citizenry. If you find you need to step back, there's no shame in that. Take care of yourself, your loved ones, and your community first. For my part, I'll continue working to illuminate these issues with balanced and nuanced perspectives, to defend democracy, promote information literacy, and help us all get a better handle on toxic polarization. I'd like to thank our expert guests, Dr. Sean Evans, Dr. Kevin Smith, and Dr. Andrew Van Horn. That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.